Hi, Paul here. Wanted to bring you this video about some things I've been thinking about pretty deeply for the last several weeks, connected to last season's podcast, if you followed along with the Willing Fool podcast. And where I would like to start today's video is on a couple of topics that may seem at first unrelated, but we'll try to explore how they may in fact be connected. One is the mental health crisis. You may or may not have heard quite a bit in the news about this recent years, but there is a sense that there's an increasing levels of anxiety, depression, just across broad swaths of our culture. People are using drugs, both prescription and illegal, in increasing measure. And one of the terms you'll hear associated with this is deaths of despair. So particularly for those who fall prey to opiate use and abuse after a years-long downward spiral of finding that they're struggling to find meaning in their life, purpose, connectedness. So people get alienated. They take these drugs to cope with their inner feelings. And obviously this just creates further downward spiral in their health, their mental health, etc. And that's not the only people affected. There's also a lot of concern within young women, especially teens. Some of it is related to social media and how that can be used so unhealthily and lead to unhealthy social pressures as well as anxiety and depression. And this mental health crisis, I would lump it with something a bit broader that's sometimes called the meaning crisis or the meta crisis, which is not necessarily just those addicted to drugs, but or even those who are suffering ill mental health necessarily, but simply this feeling of what is my purpose? What is my reason for being? Why should I fight in life for certain outcomes, to be connected, to strive for something? And people are experiencing this painful disconnection between their lives and any real meaning or coherence in their lives. And this is something broadly experienced by a whole lot of people in our culture. And so that's on one hand. And you have the individual experience of that, which is the mental health component or the disconnection from meaning. And I would say along with that, you have a sense among many people that there is something coming that's negative on the horizon for us, civilizationally, in the form of some sort of civilizational collapse or apocalypse or catastrophe, just something where things are going to change, something's going to break, something's going to snap. Some people conceive it as civil war. Some people see it as climate catastrophe. Some people see it, again, as just civilizational collapse where the systems all kind of break and can't be fixed. But there is this sense in the air, in the zeitgeist, that something's coming around the corner and it's not gonna be good. And so you got the individual experience level, you've got this collective sense of doom kind of looming there in the popular imagination. And that's on one hand. So I want you to hold that for a second. On the other hand, you've got this way of thinking, this common image. And the way I would introduce it is through a couple of popular images through literature. One is from the Lord of the Rings, this figure of Sauron. Sauron in the movie is portrayed as an eye. And in the story, at least for parts of his history, he's disembodied. He is one of these evil figures who wants more power for himself, is happy to harm people in his way. But because he's disembodied, he has to work around his disembodied nature. And one of the ways he can do that is co-opting and influencing embodied creatures to carry out his will. And once again, his design is pretty evil. He's out for more power. And as these things go, he's happy to harm people in the process if that's what's required to gain more power. Along with Sauron in Lord of the Rings is Voldemort from Harry Potter, likewise disembodied, and he is looking to become re-embodied so he can maximize his influence and power, but he's got to find a way to do that. And once more, like Sauron, he's happy to co-opt people, embodied creatures to carry out his will and help him get re-embodied so he can fully exert his evil influence and agenda on the world. So there's more portrayals, but these are just a couple of the more prominent known ones. And we have this. So when you see these characters in the movie or the books, you maybe you wouldn't have come up with it, but it kind of finds a place in your mind. You can kind of understand it. And I think this is something that's coming to be more front of mind for a lot of people right now. And I say that from a few different perspectives. One that you'll be hearing a lot about in the news if you're not already is AI, artificial intelligence. So things are progressing very fast in the AI world, and there's an arms race of sorts where companies are trying to get the biggest, most powerful, most advanced AI. And this is sort of the thing that we've feared and imagined and projected into the future for decades in our stories of creating an artificial being, an artificial intelligence that would become so powerful but it would break free of us, the creator, and start exerting its own influence and agenda. And that may or may not be good, but it could literally be our demise if this being becomes powerful enough to totally carry out its will. And even the idea that it could maybe find body somehow, that it could create a body for itself and perhaps co-opt people who are embodied to do that and to carry out its will. Anyway, this prospect, which we've had again in our imagination, is seeming to come closer and closer to fruition. You have people saying things like, this AI we think has now become sentient, something approaching a conscious agent. And you have people that are at the head of some of the companies working in AI saying things like, we are creating gods. Literally using that language. And that's the sense that many people have, is a being is being created, is coming into existence through our initiation and will, which could then detach from our control and our will and have its own will, being a conscious agent, a sentient being, something like that, disembodied, at least temporarily. And what's going to happen with that? So AI is one of those big areas where you can see this idea in real life. You also have right now an increasing interest and I think openness among more and more people to certain non-human conscious agent beings like aliens. And I don't have any statistics to back this up, but my strong sense is that I think a higher percentage of people believe in and are open to non-Earth, beings or humanoids or both than maybe ever. And I would guess maybe it's around half, around 50%. And I think it's been lower in the past. And you have plenty of literature and documentaries out there explaining why you might believe there are aliens. There was a congressional hearing several months back that was pretty high profile. People actually testifying to what they believe was evidence of extraterrestrial agents and their flying objects. And I think that kind of penetrated the collective conscious, as well as this increasing question on whether what we've been calling and thinking of and observing as aliens might in fact not be aliens, but might be something like extra-dimensional beings, spirits, or non this universe beings, like what we have called demons in past. And in the sense that the things that people say the aliens are doing are the kind of things that has been associated with the understanding of demons and lore around demons for a long time. And so what are their agenda? What are their methods? What would they be after? So there's a little bit of a blurring of the lines, and people wondering, maybe I believe in aliens, maybe I believe in demons, maybe they're the same thing, or one is explained by the other, in a way that I don't think has been too much at the front of the public consciousness, but is increasingly so now. So that's just another example of this idea of non-human beings exerting their will, having an agenda, and it may or may not be what humans' general will and agenda is, and it may or may not be something we would call positive. It may be negative. So if you hold those two things, this mental health crisis, the meaning or meta crisis, and this increase in belief and openness, and this kind of existing template of a non-human or a disembodied being exerting its will on humanity, a naive person, could be forgiven for putting two and two together and thinking, is that related to what we are experiencing now? Is that an explanation of what is going on? And I think for recent decades and maybe even centuries, that's not something we would give a lot of attention to or take very seriously. And if you're a non-religious, non-believing person, it's usually pretty easy to dismiss these sorts of things because there's just no place in it for your belief system. There's no categories for these things, and they're just sort of dismissed as a possible explanation. And then within the believing camp, I think the version of at least Christianity and maybe some strains of Judaism that has reigned for the last couple hundred years has been one in which there's this blending of, well, I believe in God, but outside of that, and maybe what I need to do to be right with God, if I want to use that language, or go to heaven, if I want to use that language, outside of that, I just have the kind of standard modern rational view of things, which is not this very densely populated cosmos with spirit beings. It's not that. It's sort of the standard model, materialism, naturalistic explanations, and then boom, God, just the God hypothesis kind of layered on top of that. And there are more options of that within the traditional strains of Christianity, but that's been the one that's really held forth. And so the message is God, the message is Jesus if you're Christian, and then what you need to do just on an individual level to sort of secure your place or your future. And that is, once again, that's a strain of Christian belief or thought, but it's not the only one. But in that strain, the one that's reigned supreme and dominant in recent years and decades, there isn't a whole lot of place for this weirdly, mysteriously peopled cosmos including non-human beings. So that's kind of where we're at. Now, I mentioned that in the last podcast season, I explored these different topics, and I didn't really know what the thread was. I kind of just started picking topics that I thought were interesting, that were in the news and that were making me think really hard, and I didn't understand very well or couldn't make much sense of. It was something just kind of bugging me. And what I found through picking them apart was that, to me, there seemed to be a thread running through many, if not all of them, which was that these were all things that revealed things going on and thought processes that we were having and ways of looking at the world that we were sharing in and seeing, that all in different ways undercut, sabotage what is distinctive about being human, about what is sort of the highest possible calling and vocation, destiny, teleos of humanity. And again, I found that just by trying to think through it, like, what's bugging me about this? And that seemed to be one of the threads. So going back to that possible explanation, that sort of theory or proposition, this would make sense. This would make a lot of sense that if there is an entity bent on undermining humanity, of keeping humanity from thriving, from flourishing, from fulfilling its destiny and its purpose, this would be great. Like, hit it from this angle, hit it from this angle, hit it from this angle. Take, for example, identity politics. Well, identity politics, we've got this very popular increasing in strength way of viewing things now, which is most problems and conflicts in history can be simply explained in terms of oppressors and oppressed. And the oppressors and oppressed fall along group identity lines, so group demographics. And this should be caveated at least a little bit by saying, of course, this has happened. Groups have oppressed other groups, and that's a fact. To take that and make a worldview out of it, to explain almost everything or everything in terms of that, almost exclusively, and to draw the lines pretty sharply along group lines, that is interesting. Because if, going back to the mental health crisis, the deaths of despair, the meaning crisis, if there were a conscious agent or agents working to oppress and alienate humans, and was at work doing that, then if the humans could be convinced that, yes, there's oppression and suppression going on, and primarily it is each other, who are responsible, that would be a coup. That would be a great strategic move. Because whether you're on the oppressor or oppressed end of that, it's something that's going to, in all likelihood, increase hostility, increase resentment, pit people against each other, and resentments in both directions. Increase resentment, increase hostilities, a downward spiral for both groups, the individuals in them, and them together. Meanwhile, oppression and suppression that is happening at a different level is completely invisible. It can't be seen, and it's suspicion-free. It's got off scot-free. That would be a coup. That would be a genius strategy to execute. That's group identity politics, which is, I would say, reaching a fever pitch at this point. Then you've got something like, two trans movements. You've got transgender ideology, I'm going to call it, and that is reaching a level that I don't know that has ever existed before, certainly not in my lifetime or in our culture. And then you've got, perhaps connected with that, or related at least conceptually in some ways, is the transhuman movement, which is smaller, but people who are interested or think it's a good thing if people can transcend their humanity and become part human, part machine, part human, part algorithm, a cyborg of sorts. And this might seem out there, but there are people, very smart people and very wealthy people, pursuing this right now, and they think it's a great idea, and that this is the future, either for some humans or for humanity in general, that this is the only way to escape our doom. Well, how's that related to transgender? Well, they're related perhaps conceptually in that, for one thing, throughout history and across cultures, male and female has been a thing, like a substantial, meaningful, categorical difference, and something important to humanity, reality, life, whatever you want to call it. Maybe somewhat different ways of handling it, but certainly that they're meaningful, important categories. And obviously that's being called into question with increasing intensity and in some cases stridency. That male and female is hyperbole, it's a human construct, it is backward primitive thinking, and then it can be used to confine and restrict and oppress people. That's the function it's serving. And that to insist on distinctions and meaning in it is indirectly and implicitly impressive in itself. That's a big jump. That's a big jump from how most of humanity across cultures have thought of male and female. And to be very favorable, it's very questionable, is a nice way, I think, of saying it. But if I can convince you that I am a woman in a man's body, or that you are a woman in a man's body, that is saying so much, because now who I am, what does that mean? It is something inner only, and it exists in my mind, and it is divorced from and disconnected from my body. That's a big jump. That's a big deal. And there's always been a strain of thinking that says, I'm not my body, and my body is sort of incidental and accidental, and it's arbitrary, and it is it's made of matter, which means it's kind of like not really the essence of real stuff, because the real stuff is invisible, and not matter, because matter is maybe even bad or tainted or not spiritual enough. That strain of Gnosticism is present in the transgender ideology. And if I can convince you that it's possible to be a woman in a man's body, or a man in a woman's body, then the door is also open for can I be a non-human in a human body? And maybe I think that I am something else. I really feel that I am something else. And if there's nothing particularly distinctive or inherently meaningful about being a human, then I think the door is open for that question. And so can I identify as something else, an animal or something like that? Perhaps. Can I become or identify as a machine or a human-machine mixture, a cyborg? I don't really see why you can't. There's nothing particularly meaningful about being a human. There's no goal or purpose of being a human. So, yeah, it's a blank check. It's a blank slate. Write it how you want to write it. Be who you want to be. Who can argue with that? And so these doors are open for undermining and calling into question or just refuting that there is something specifically distinctive, and therefore with it something particularly noble, something that is calling us forward, a vocation of what it means to be a human. And that's one big area. Another one is just the incredible, rapid increase in complexity of our society. I think it's happening on all kinds of fronts. I don't know if you notice it, but I feel like I'm noticing it more and more in all kinds of ways. I think this may be connected to people's sense that some sort of implosion is impending, because, well, things have gotten so complex. We have systems on systems, and our systems control our other systems, and things are getting so complex that it's like nobody in particular, and maybe we in general, don't have enough understanding of how our systems are all working. They're incredible complexity. And so it's almost like they have a life of their own, almost like the AI thing, with a different flavor, but they've got their own momentum. The complexity is unavoidable. I mean, I am out of juice when it comes to creating passwords. Like the bar keeps getting raised because there's an arms race between the people trying to kind of protect IT security and the people trying to hack and just bring things down and abuse them. And so it's just one directional. It's just more and more complex. But there's times now where I can't even create a password complex enough. And then I've had 2 incidences in the last few months where the password generation filter thing itself wasn't working and nobody could figure it out, but it was just broken. Like the system that says your password is good or good or not good enough itself was broken, but it was hard to figure that out just because it was so complex. I don't even know how many passwords I have now, maybe thousands. If you would have told me 20 years ago that you're going to have thousands of passwords and that to download a $1.99 app you might need a password, wouldn't make sense to me. I can't believe the number of things I sign now without reading. You can't read everything that you sign, but you're signing saying, I read, I understand, and I commit, and I agree, which used to be a big deal, but it's impossible for it to be a big deal now because you could not effectively function in our society by doing what you're saying you're doing. So every time I sign, it's a little fudge, a little lie, and theoretically, I could have 100 lawyers on my doorstep tomorrow telling me all the things I committed to that I had no idea. And then I'm in some sense, I'm on the hook for them, at least technically, but it's not probably enforceable or going to happen. So there's just this growing disconnect between what is supposedly happening and what we're saying is happening and what is happening. And all these things, they have a momentum all their own. Nobody's in charge. Nobody's directing it. I don't think it's some Illuminati conspiracy, but it is happening. And it is something that's becoming more and more complex, almost infinitely so. And when you get something that just keeps getting infinitely complex, eventually it will break. It's going to happen. And then the question will be, can anybody fix it? And I think we're reaching the point where that just seems unlikely and doubtful. And at what scale? I mean, it already happens on small scales. The other day I had Chase Bank email me and say they had a problem. It was potentially fraud. And I replied. The email looked great. It looked legitimate. Usually I can smell scammers and phishers. But I replied, and then I had second thoughts. Like, maybe this isn't Chase. So I called them and had somebody on the line. And I was trying to find out from them if they were trying to reach out to me so that I could determine if this was a scam or not. And the person told me they thought no. But I was simply aware that I really, at this point, did not have much trust or faith that someone at Chase would know if someone at Chase was reaching out to me, because within that company, and not Chase specifically, but just large companies in general, they are so complex that very often the right hand does not know what the left hand is doing. And so here you've got this entity interacting in a way where you would hope there was transparency and communication, but it's not an expectation that I have. At this point, I've had so many interactions where I've reached out to someone at a company that is doing something, and I say, I think this is what's happening, or this is my theory, and they'll say, no, that's not what's happening, or we don't think so. And then just through sheer persistence, asking questions, waiting, following through, many times, after 20 minutes or 2 hours or a week, it'll come out, oh no, we were doing that, sorry. And this is the company that did it. I'm just hypothesizing and guessing. And so in the case of Chase, it wasn't because that worker was incompetent or dumb or anything like that. I didn't even think that. I just thought, this is my baseline expectation now. Because of the radically increasing complexity, it's just impossible for anybody to get their hands around it. My wife has spent time trying to set up my kids' little watches that act like phones, and she'll get an IT person to help her, and it's their job. They're the experts. They know how these things work and how to set them up, and it'll just, in some cases, take hours and hours and hours, and they try, 25 different things to make it work, trying to figure out what's wrong, troubleshoot. And I know these things have always existed, but the number of them, in my experience, is vastly higher in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years than ever before. It's just a regular part of life to manage this increasing complexity. I think at one point we thought that having all this technology, all it would do was save us time and energy. And then we would work less, we'd work like 20 hours a week because we've got all this intelligence. But the way I think it's working is not that. I spend so many hours a week just wrestling with technology, trying to backtrack and troubleshoot and figure out what's wrong with this so that I can do this, so that I can figure out what's wrong with that. And sometimes I'm 3 steps removed from the original problem I was trying to solve, because there's just layers of problems, because there's so many layers of complexity. So I'm just describing something that it's not directed, again, by any one person, and I don't even think it's directed by a conspiracy, but it is something that's happening. It's in motion, and it is a technology that is squeezing out the role of human consciousness and understanding, and it has a life in a sense of its own, a life of its own, kind of like this AI thing. There's obviously all kinds of opportunity for governments, for technological companies to use this increasing complexity, or to use it either directly or as a reason to become more surveilling, to be more controlling, to try to account for everything so that we can be more responsible and oversee what's happening. So anyway, there's always going to be the opportunity and the tendency for large, powerful entities, whether they be companies, whether they be governments, whether they be technocrats, to increase their power. And sometimes this happens, again, not through any particular person or conspiracy, but through simply bureaucratic creep, the tendency of a system to keep gaining more and more power. And so all these things are instances where something is happening, not necessarily through an orchestrated attempt, but through something seeming to take on a life and an energy and a momentum all of its own. You can think about war and hostilities, how even the buildup of nuclear arsenals through the last many decades, everybody can look at it and say, this is not good. Like, this is so dangerous. The drawbacks far outweigh the benefits. And yet, these things have a increasing nature to them that nobody seems to be able to cut against because they have their own life, they have their own momentum. You can think about things that are not related to that but function the same way, like social media addiction and phone addiction and computer screen addiction. We know as a culture, as a society, that we are spending way too much time on devices. We're spending way too much time connected. Every study shows this. Everybody knows it. And yet each of us individually has to fight our own battle and seems to be, many times, in many ways, powerless to stop it, or at least that it takes an incredible amount of devoted, attentive energy to go against the grain. And there's more phenomena like that I could mention, but the point being, these things, they take on a life of their own. It's easy to say, well, we should just not do it, or we should stop it. And yet it's very, very hard to do that very thing. And so what I want to investigate in future videos and keep unpacking is we've seen these things. We've seen the image of the Sauron, the entity that doesn't have a body but seems to have an agenda. We've seen the place that this has in our popular imagination, and we've seen it become of greater and greater interest in respect to AI. We've seen the interest in spirit beings, demons, as well as aliens. This play out. We've seen the meaning crisis, the meta crisis, the mental health crisis, all these things. And so, again, if you put these together, you could forgive a person for coming to the conclusion there seems to be an agenda, a program that is looking to undercut, to undermine humanity. What makes humanity distinctive, what helps humanity thrive. And again, there may not be a place in your mind and your current thinking for, oh, sure, we're going to attribute that to an entity with an agenda or a will or a conscious agent or group of agents. And yet, if that's how things seem to be happening, I've grown over time to have a little bit more respect for when something is happening as if X, Y, Z, fill in the blank. It's really good to pay attention to that as if. Even if what follows it seems like something that can't be true or doesn't make sense or I don't have a category for, just slow down. Let your right brain do a little bit of the hard work. Think of the whole picture. Entertain that as if scenario, as if maybe it has some validity. Even if it doesn't make sense, even if it seems crazy, just it's good to be able to distinguish between as if and is, but sometimes it's good also to let that line be a little blurry because it helps you, especially helps, I think, your right brain to, which is very, very powerful and very good at figuring things out, to figure out what may be going on that you currently don't have a clear-cut explanation or category for. And I think in this case, that's a really wise thing to do. I'd like to unpack that through some additional videos, just giving us reason to slow down the thought process on this sort of thinking into, well, if I'm so confident in my my quote modern way of thinking, is there anything that I might be missing? And that is there any additional ways of thinking that have some weight, have some validity, that are worth considering? And if I quickly dismiss the as if scenario, I never get to see them. I never even get an opportunity to really weigh them out. So that is the thought for today. That's where I think we'll land for today. But I want to thank you for paying attention. And this is it's gonna be thought-provoking, challenging, but also exciting. So tune into the future videos as well. Thanks for your time today.